Yesterday we saw the passing of George Herbert Walker Bush, also known as Poppy, the father of the Klan, the father of the crime family. And so all of the mainstream media were in laudatory commemoration mode. We are going to talk about the beautiful and wonderful things. Probably the most striking that I saw, and I could stand very little of it, frankly, was that Billy Graham's son, Franklin Graham, was called upon by Fox News to give accolades, to tell wonderful platitudes and sweet things about Poppy Bush, about how a family squabble had necessitated, about spirituality, had necessitated them calling Billy Graham to settle a score. What was the way to heaven, they wanted to know. And Franklin Graham ended up saying to these Fox folks, hey, look, he was the gentle giant of a man. And I'm going to say to you, he was not gentle. At least he may have been outwardly, but he certainly wasn't behind the scenes. He certainly did not conduct himself with gentility as it relates to the rest of us humans, and he was no giant, not in any positive sense. So let's talk about the real George Herbert Walker Bush, Poppy, and to the mainstream media accolades, I will say, oh, about Poppy? Well, that's poppycock. Let's go for it. To go back to the origin of the Bushes, well, or at least a recent origin of the Bushes, one has to know that George Herbert Walker Bush was the son of Prescott Bush, who on the face of it was a United States Senator, a prominent businessman, involved with Brown Brothers Harriman and the Union Bank for decades, was a skull and bones himself, as was maternal side of the family, George Herbert Walker, which gave us George Herbert Walker Bush. So the two, Prescott Bush and George Herbert Walker, were both skull and bones men from Yale, as was Poppy. And they were not shy violets about how they interacted with our government, even back into the 30s. One that one should know is, if you followed the record of Smedley Butler, Major General of the Marine Corps, who was asked by a bunch of businessmen to overthrow the recently elected Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And while one could say, especially if you've looked at my videos, gee, it was probably a pretty good idea to get rid of Roosevelt, it was not the way to do it. And what they were looking at was a military coup, and they were trying to recruit Smedley Butler because he was one of the most respected and prominent men in the country, and he could have pulled off the coup with his popularity with the military, the post-World War I military. Smedley, on the other hand, had other ideas because he was a patriot, and he ended up turning them all in and having hearings in Congress. But what happened to these guys? Allegedly, including Henry Ford, J.D. Rockefeller, John Foster Dulles, Allen Dulles, Prescott Bush, and George Herbert Walker, the guys that wanted to tip over our government with a dictatorial coup, a military coup. Nothing happened to them. There were hearings. They were basically kept out of the limelight. So we get into the late 1930s, early 1940s, and the United States finds itself in war against, as part of the Allied invasion and part of the Allied troops with the Soviet Union and Great Britain and the British Commonwealth countries, and we are against the Germans. And so what do we find out then? Well, Prescott Bush is helping to finance the Nazis. He's providing them with cover, he's providing financing, he is engaging them in multiple ways, and finally in 1942 they raid the bank, shut them down, and in either case did they nail Prescott Bush for sedition or for treason or for dealing with the enemy or attempting to violently overthrow the government. No, none of that happened. So in the 50s, he became a United States Senator, I think from Connecticut, and was there for 2 terms, I think. So Poppy, on the other hand, went into the war, was a young guy, was in the Pacific, was a Navy pilot, was flying a bomber off the aircraft carriers, which is to his credit. He had a bombing run where he and his crew were shot at and had a flame out or a burning engine, and they ended up bailing. 2 of the guys didn't make it. One didn't have a parachute that opened. One never got out of the plane. The other 2 made it onto a raft and spent a month in a submarine after they were rescued. He ended up doing several other significant things, apparently, as a war hero, and was given commendations and medals as a result of it. So he came out a war hero. What happened to the 2 airmen who didn't make it, Poppy sometimes skips over, but he made it. Then he ended up going to Yale and became a skull and bones man, was a cheerleader for Yale, and was a baseball guy who was, I think, captain of the team his last year. Good stuff, supposedly, right? Then he ended up becoming a new owner or part owner or manager of an outfit called Zapata Petroleum in the early 50s. And guess who was there to join in with him? Well, it was George Herbert Walker, the bank financier, and Allen Dulles, a fellow skull and bones guy who was also at the top of the CIA. So they set up this allegedly operating oil company operated by George Herbert Walker Bush out of Texas, out of Midland, and then Houston. And it is doing offshore oil drilling, which is close to Cuba, oddly enough. And then the Bay of Pigs happens. And while Bush is never implicated directly, there are all kinds of linkages with George Herbert Walker Bush and the Bay of Pigs invasion, including the fact that there are boats named craft that are going after the Cubans that are named Barbara, Houston, and the operation itself is called Zapata. So in addition to the Bay of Pigs invasion, it's also called Zapata. Odd that the invasion has the same name that George Herbert Walker Bush's oil company has, isn't it? And then he ended up working with other oil companies, all tied in, I think Dresser Industries and others, all tied in again with the CIA or with the banking cartel or with his father-in-law, the bankers, and other investors. So that gets him to becoming a Republican in Texas, two-time congressman. Then he gets into the weeds for a while. Then he becomes the envoy to China under Nixon after he failed in a Senate campaign, after he lost in a Senate campaign to Lloyd Bentsen. And then he became the CIA director, during which time he said, oh, no, he had no prior connection with the CIA. Well, as it turns out, there are at least one Bush and perhaps two George Bushes that had CIA connections. And when did they have those CIA connections? Well, one of them had them in 1963, oddly enough. And not only that, but George Herbert Walker Bush can't remember where he was or when it happened that he learned of the murder of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the assassination. Now, anybody that was over 10 years old in the United States knew exactly where he was, and I think there were only 2 or 3 in the United States, adults, that couldn't remember, George Herbert Walker Bush being one of them. Not only that, but he made a phone call, allegedly with a tip, from neighboring area around Dallas about that same time to set up cover. He was in that area. He had a speech that day, and there are pictures, and I'll show you the picture, which looks amazingly like George Herbert Walker Bush standing against the Dealey Plaza area at the time. You make the call. So we've got the Bay of Pigs and then perhaps Dealey Plaza. That would make George Herbert Walker Bush, if true, would make him one of 4 presidents who were either implicated in the assassination of John Kennedy or ended up hiding or covering up the facts. So we have LBJ. I think that's pretty clear. We have Richard Nixon. We have J. Edgar Hoover. We have the oil guys, the mafia, the Cubans, the Federal Reserve, and perhaps more. And after that, we had Mr. Ford, Gerald R. Ford, that was on the commission that came up, and he being a key player, that came up with the fancy 3-bullet theory that made Oswald, in some fashion, potentially liable as something other than a patsy, when in fact there were probably 5 or 6 or 7 shooters, and that George Herbert Walker Bush might well have been the organizer for the CIA that was overseeing them that day. Isn't that a good thing? And then we have the dust up for Vietnam and the fact that there was opium transport there, and the CIA was helping to transport the opium out of the triangle where Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia are. And then we have, of course, the CIA connection of Bush himself. Then we have George Herbert Walker Bush being chosen to be vice president for Ronald Reagan after his failed attempt to run for president. Reagan later saying to California representatives that he was forced to take Bush as the vice president, and that he was told that if he did not take Bush as the vice president, they were going to excoriate him, they were going to blame him for things, they were going to charge him with things, they were going to make up stuff that would cause him to lose the presidency. A few months after that, we have little John Hinckley shooting Ronald Reagan. Where did that come from? John Hinckley was just a crazed young man trying to please, who was it? Some actress, I can't remember what her name is now. And it turns out, he was going to be a lone wolf, but he may well not have shot the shot that hit Reagan, that almost killed him. And as it turns out, George Herbert Walker Bush is a good friend of the Hinckley family, of the Hinckley parents, and had lunch with them within the same week that Hinckley allegedly did the attempted assassination. But their little boy had psychological problems, that is, the Hinckleys, and he was probably in the safest place he could have been, and after an attempt. So we move from there to the vice presidency of George Herbert Walker Bush. I'm going to put on the page here, you'll see the alleged sex trafficking that's going on at the end of the Reagan term. We also have the Iran-Contra matter, where they're trading guns and coming up with money to fund the Iran-Contras, or the Contras, and using Iran as an exchange. Gets Reagan into a lot of trouble. Did Reagan know anything about it? No, but I'm going to tell you, I think little George Herbert Walker Bush did. Then he becomes president, and he says to us, read my lips, no new taxes, which of course he doesn't do. And then he loses. And at the time, I kind of thought that Bush was a fairly well-qualified president. He'd been CIA envoy to China, congressman, successful businessman, vice president for 8 years. What more could you ask for? One of the best qualified guys there had been. But there was something odd about the way he ran in 1992 against Clinton. He just didn't seem to have any fire for it. At the time, I thought that was kind of crazy. And then I learned that they're in cahoots, and they were in cahoots before. And they may well have been in cahoots at Mena, Arkansas, when Barry Seal was bringing in cocaine from Central America and taking guns out to the bunch and the Contras there. And they were dumping the stuff off in Mena, Arkansas, and there are regular claims that the CIA was running the drugs and that Clinton and Bush were both in on. Would that surprise you? Not only has George Herbert Walker Bush been deeply involved in lots of things that don't well suit us as a country, but he was a purveyor, a proponent, an early advocate of the New World Order. And he was the one to introduce it to us in the 90s, in the late 80s and 90s, to tell us how we were going to have this wonderful new world that was going to put us all in better stead. Well, I will say to you, one thing I appreciate about President Trump is that as a nationalist, and as he describes it, he sees the preeminence, the singular identity of our nation and of our country, the United States, as a nationalist task, which in fact he does have. And the fact that George Herbert Walker Bush was pushing the New World Order, was working with the United Nations, had friends like Henry Kissinger and the Rockefellers and others, and was actually working to undermine the singular distinctiveness about this country during his entire public career, says a great deal about him, and none of it's good. Then you have the allegation, and it's fairly well substantiated, that George Herbert Walker Bush is in on the drug transfer and sales by the CIA and by our military of the drugs, of the opium and the poppies that came out of Afghanistan. Well, we were told in 2001 that the reason we had to go after the Taliban in Afghanistan was that they were harboring that evil Osama bin Laden, and we needed to take them down. And not only that, they were massacring their own kind. They had a dictatorship. They were fundamentalist Muslims. They had destroyed the country, and we needed to go in and save it. That we needed to get the women out of the burqas, right? Well, as it turns out, the Taliban had shut down the opium fields in Afghanistan, and at the time it was producing 90% of the poppies for opium that was coming out of there. Who was dealing in that? Well, it could very well have been our own CIA. And who was involved in it? Well, it could very well have been our buddy, George Herbert Walker Bush, also called Poppy. Get it? Poppy, of the poppy fields. And even though that may not have been why they called him that at the start. So within a year of us invading Afghanistan, guess what happened? The poppy fields went back into business and have been booming ever since. While we protect the poppy fields, somebody else we, the United States government, the United States military, somebody else is making money trafficking those drugs and creating great havoc in this country with the epidemic of opium. So we're going to talk about what a wonderful guy George Herbert Walker Bush was. I would say to you that perhaps you might look at him a little differently, and while all these mainstream media accolades come flying through, let's take a real deep breath. Let's give thanks in this season that George Herbert Walker Bush has quietly passed on, and I bid you adieu. Poppy Bush, I bid you adieu. If you like this video, give a thumbs up. I think it's time for us to be real about it. I know some of you are going to say, oh my goodness, he's disrespecting the dead, and you should never speak ill of the dead at this time, right? Yeah, well, when it comes to McCain and George Herbert Walker Bush, we should give thanks for the fact that they have perhaps passed on, and that it is time for us to shift. May there never be another major political figure in this country as dark and evil as George Herbert Walker Bush. Thank you for watching.